This is another video in the series on the history of New Orleans, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Mara Keire, who is a senior research fellow at the Rothermere American Institute of Oxford University. She's also the author in 2010 of a book called For Business and Pleasure, Red Light Districts and the Regulation of Vice in the United States, 1890 to 1933. Welcome, Mara. I was wondering if we could sort of start out with, obviously this is about New Orleans, or the series of interviews and so forth. And Storyville is by quite a long distance the most famous red light district in American history, although the point of your book is to sort of demonstrate that it's also by a long shot not the only one. Could you tell us a little bit about what Storyville was and how it comes about, and sort of what role does it play in the city during its existence?
So Storyville was a red light district which was defined by law, which was actually quite unusual in the 1890s. The main story about Storyville is often told by jazz historians who are saying that this was an opportunity for the French and the French culture and heritage to celebrate New Orleans's cultural and sexual laissez-faire attitudes. And so they brought together into these certain defined number of city blocks all the prostitutes and musicians and sporting folk into what became known as Storyville. But in the name, you can actually see some of the problems with that narrative, which is that Story is named after Sidney Story. And Story was an uptown politician. He was not French, he was not Catholic, I believe he was Baptist, or if not Baptist, he was certainly Presbyterian. And he created Storyville through city ordinance because he wanted to disempower the urban machine. He wanted to get the brothels and the related sort of drinking establishments out of the rest of the city and put them into a commercial district right near the central business district, the CBD, right near Canal Street. He wanted to move saloons away from the neighborhoods because he didn't want ward bosses to get the payouts from the saloons and the saloon keepers. And he thought that putting everybody, all this disreputable leisure into one space would bankrupt the city machine. What he didn't really consider was that geographic stability meant the possibility of improvement to buildings, but also advertisement. If you're going to be someplace for a long time, you can start advertising. And so New Orleans created what they called blue books, which were guides to the red light district. They also got their own city councilman, Tom Anderson, who had the saloon, which was right at the corner of the corner closest to where the train station was. So everybody knew Tom Anderson. It was the first stop that you could go to after you got off the train. And everybody could also go and supplicate to him if they wanted favors done with the machine. So, so Storyville is very much tied into the urban politics of the period and some of the big battles between the machine, which was Democratic, though everybody was pretty much Democratic in New Orleans, and the uptown Protestant reformers who had this idea of trying to clean up both New Orleans in terms of the amount of drinking going on, but also to clean up New Orleans reputationally.
So maybe it might be good to sort of back up a little bit and just explain briefly what the machine was And also, I was intrigued by what you said about the connections between saloons and the political machine and ward bosses. You know, so why would it be if you cleared the saloons out of the rest of New Orleans, which sounds like quite a difficult thing to do, but if you
Yeah.
managed to do that, how would
Yeah.
that have some pretty immediate political effects?
Okay, so so the urban machine was the very grassroots organizing of the Democratic Party. It was block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, ward by ward, and actually the ward is the is sort of the organizational unit of the political party, and it's tied to the Democratic Party and getting out the vote for the Democratic Party. And it was the strength of urban politics. It was the backbone of urban politics in this period. If you wanted a favor, you went to your ward boss. If you got the favor from your ward boss, then there was something expected in return, which was often to get out the vote and to make sure that your friends voted. The machine was also, though, it was notoriously corrupt in terms of finances. They were always rather sketchy, particularly when it came to awarding contracts such as building infrastructure and other kinds of sort of city building welfare projects, but it was also considered by many working class people one of the few sources of unquestioned aid. So unlike the charity, which often came with reputational requirements, the urban machine would give out turkeys, shoes, etc., without question. And so it was two very different models for what urban politicians should do to help the poor and the working class within their cities. And the more elite, the reformers in the North, the Republicans, had this vision of respectability and providing for those who were in need, who were respectable. And they also had this vision of trying to improve the environment, of separating work from leisure, of separating residence from business areas, of separating retail from industry. And so this is where you get things like the slaughterhouse cases, which also have, you know, a key tie-in to race. And part of this sort of attempt to draw lines, and I would actually sort of halt here and say for a moment that this progressive impulse, this anti-machine impulse, was also quite tied to Jim Crow, and that this was another way of drawing boundaries, that they liked to put, these reformers liked to put people and places into categories. And they liked sort of a monoculture to a neighborhood, that this would be, you know, all white, it would be all residential. This area would be all retail. Another area would be all leisure. A third area would be all factories and industry. And creating red light districts was part of this organizational impulse for reshaping the city into what they considered a healthier, more moral space. As far as the economics and their economic argument about moving saloons, saloons and saloon keepers were often city councilmen and ward bosses, and through the local, they were able to organize the get out the vote. And they were able to organize party support. And there was an expectation that people would drink at these saloons and that the saloon keepers would then pay a tithe, so to speak, to the different ward bosses and to the party.
Mhm. That's interesting. That's very, there's a continuity there with the Reconstruction period. I'm doing some research on a saloon keeper in the Third Ward who was a really major kind of Republican organizer for that ward, and also kind of like labor organizing campaigner and things
Yeah.
like that. So the interconnections of this are really interesting. Uh, I also think I did a little bit of work a few years ago on the 1914 bubonic plague outbreak, and there was a similar sort of dynamic there where the reformers were really down on Mayor Martin Berman and the machine, and there were also like some state level political conflicts there, because at this time, if I am remembering correctly, because the machine was very tightly organized and disciplined, and because of the size of New Orleans within the state of Louisiana, you had a similar dynamic that you would have, I think, maybe in Illinois with Chicago, or other states that are mostly rural, but with a humongous city. And so there were like these state level politics where they're trying to do anything they could to stifle the power of the machine, because otherwise they couldn't control anything at the state level. I think. Does that play out with the sort of red light district discussions and debates?
I mean, I think less so with the red light district. I mean, you see this dynamic in New York, where between Manhattan and Albany, and you also see this in California with San Francisco and Sacramento. The state level definitely supported the reform efforts to clean up the city, to introduce what was known as high license, to decrease the number of saloons, and to generally try and make New Orleans have a more respectable reputation, to invite in industry and investment and stuff like that. But because New Orleans, because these reformers were very much involved in shaping city space, things like the red light district surprisingly become statewide. So even though New Orleans has this reputation and Storyville has this reputation of being the only legal red light district in the whole United States, that's not true. And in fact, I mean, there was a legal red light district in Shreveport, which culturally could not be more different than New Orleans. New Orleans is ethnic, it's Catholic, it's highly Irish. The machine is very immigrant friendly. There is not a single business. And Shreveport is Baptist, it's reliant on the oil industry, and it is much more ethnically homogenous. So, but both use the same legal construction for creating their red light districts, which was defining out boundaries, which is to say, prostitution will be illegal outside of these particular parameters on the map. And so they didn't make it legal within the district, but it was just illegal outside the district. And this is a very curious construction, and it's not something that comes about by happenstance. So, so New Orleans is both unique, but it is also very much structurally, when it comes to anti-vice, of a period, and very much part of this longer anti-machine effort, in terms of how it manages its vice.
And I also wonder about if you could say a bit, you sort of hinted at it in something you said earlier, about sort of how this plays out in terms of the image of New Orleans in the rest of the country. I remember reading a newspaper article from 1912 or 1914 where the mayor is speaking to a convention of traveling salesmen or pharmacists or something. And he says he doesn't quite use the formulation, what happens in New Orleans stays in New Orleans, but it comes very, very close to saying that. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a bit different. I've got another interview in the series with Anthony Stenonis about the sort of beginnings of tourism in New Orleans. How does that play in terms of the image that the city is kind of projecting out to the country?
Well, there's a real fight over the image that they're projecting out. The people who are associated with the machine are very happy to have it be, the Southern Babylon, as it was called at the time, and as Alicia P. Long named her very good book on New Orleans and Vice in New Orleans. And indeed, the pro-segregationist, and that was the term used for those who supported red light districts, the pro-segregationists used the fact that they had a red light district as a way to attract the convention trade. And they were doing this specifically and purposefully. And they were like so excited when they got the Shriners to come. And so there's like in the New Orleans newspapers, and during, I forget if it was 1912 or something like that, the Shriner Convention happens in New Orleans, and there's just sort of ecstatic about the coverage. And of course, some of the Shriners get, in trouble in Storyville, but they cover it in the same sort of, tongue-in-cheek way you would cover a tourist during Mardi Gras having problems on Bourbon Street. And this was actually something that was across the country, that that the machine political supporters of the red light districts, and of course the owners of the red light districts and the landlords who owned the buildings for the red light districts, were all saying, this is incredible for business. If we close down the red light districts, we're not going to get the convention business. They're just going to go to cities which have brothels and, dance halls and music halls and saloons that are fun to attend.
Like Shreveport.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, eventually Storyville does come to an end. And could you sort of explain that, but then maybe also put it in the context of why these sort of formalized, regulated vice districts in a lot of other cities, because there are, these red light districts. One of the things that's interesting about your book, and surprising to all of us when we read it, was that it wasn't just New Orleans and Shreveport. It was, you could give us a list of all these unlikely little places that had similar, smaller scale things. But how does the demise of Storyville fit in with the overall timeline of the ending of this way of structuring vice and segregating urban space in these ways?
Yeah. So it was World War I that brought the end to Storyville. There had been a movement amongst, again, reformers. Reformers had decided after the 1890s that, oops, they made a mistake by bringing vice into one neighborhood, that in fact, as I said earlier, it attracted patrons because they knew where they could go, and there could be advertisements and, material investment. And so around 1909, there started to be a movement against red light districts and working towards closing red light districts. And between 1909 and 1917, a number of really important red light districts closed across the nation. But by 1917, it had reached a stalemate in many cities. And New Orleans is one of those cities where the reformers they had gotten as much as they could in terms of passing city council and the state legislature in terms of high license and putting limits on, what counted as a saloon, how many people that you could have at any one time in a building, all sorts of, sort of small at the edges attempts to make the party a little less raucous. But it was a stalemate, and they needed to bring in the federal government to break the stalemates. And World War I provided the perfect opportunity for progressive reformers to mobilize the state. And across the country, there was what was known as Section 12 and 13 of the War Act. And that involved closing red light districts within, I think it was a 5 or 10 mile radius of any training camp. And so some cities like Shreveport actually proactively closed their vice district because they wanted a training camp. And so, you know, that was actually, I thought was quite amusing to say, no, no, here, me, us, we want your business, you know, let's close down the vice district. And while New Orleans, which was of course under the power of the Navy, were like, are you kidding? You know, not unless you actually bring in the troops are we going to close down, you know, access to the troops. But finally, after a lot of threats, and actually the threat to remove all shipping through the port of New Orleans and all the Navy, anything relating to the Navy through the port of New Orleans, Berman closed Storyville.
Yeah.
And so this, yeah.
So then what effect would you say that has on the political machine then after that closes? I mean, obviously World War I has huge effects on all sorts of different things, but can you trace much direct effect of the closure of Storyville on the old regular machine?
So less on the machine, more on America's musical landscape. Storyville was a place where a lot of the great jazz musicians first started, and where they learned from each other. And so when Storyville closed, they went upriver. So they went to Kansas City, they went to Chicago. The machine itself was highly adaptable. It is adaptable. That is one of its key characteristics. And what happened, I think, with the reformers is that they went too far, because they were not just closing the red light districts, they also introduced prohibition. And prohibition was part of the same push. And New Orleans embraced prohibition wholeheartedly, particularly in breaking it. And the money that could be made in defying the prohibition orders, which again brought people in because it was considered one of the wettest and most open towns of the whole South. And of course, the Mississippi Delta really allows for easy smuggling. So it worked very well for New Orleans, and the money flowed in to both the illegal sellers of liquor and to the machine who were protecting the sale and distribution of alcohol in New Orleans.
It's interesting the continuities of New Orleans history, that, you know, smuggling is a really big deal in the early phase of the city's history in the 18th century, and then it sort of pops up again, you know, when it's needed in the 1920s. Well, this has been really very interesting. Are there any sort of last things that you would want to be sure that people sort of remember about Storyville and about red light districts more generally before we wind things up?
I think one of the things I would say about red light districts that are really fascinating is that they are racially mixed spaces. There's status issues within them, and oftentimes they're segregated in terms of customers, that there will be Black brothels that only let in white customers. But socially, it was quite mixed. And I think that was also another reason why uptown white reformers were very intent on closing down the vice districts. And I think that we often, and so you could have very high status Black madams, club owners, musicians, prostitutes who were the highest of the high status of the sporting class, which really proposed an alternative vision of what society could look like. And it had its problems, and it was misogynistic, and it was racist in its own way, and it had its own internal codes, but it was an alternate model than the respectable city. And I think that that was the danger for many reformers. That was the challenge it presented. And I think it's one of the reasons why there was such an assiduous move against red light districts.
Well, thanks very much. This has been really informative and touches on a lot of sort of big issues that have run through this series of lectures and interviews and so forth. And I'd just like to thank you for taking a bit of time today to share all this with us. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Bruce.